Hi, this is a THM room that lets you hack into a scammer's website and destroy their entire work with a simple command. The difficulty of this room? It's impossible. Easy. Supposedly, this would take me 90 minutes to complete. The real time it took me was about 3 hours. But I'm gonna show you how to complete it in this amount of time. My goal for this machine is not just to get the root flag, it is to gain root privileges and destroy the machine completely until it's unusable. So we start the machine and wait about 5 business days for it to actually boot, and then do our recon by running an nmap to see the technologies this server is using. Right off the bat, we can see that the machine has an SSH port on 22, an HTTP port on 80, and a Samba, also called SMB port, on 139 and 445. Now, because there is an SMB port open, Nmap will automatically try to connect to that SMB using a guest user, and if it succeeds, it will output that for us. Isn't that really cool? I mean, we pretty much don't have to do anything. So we can see that it succeeds in doing so, and now we just have to find out the share name so we can log in as a guest. Fortunately, hacking is the easiest job in the world, and there is a command that will just do that for us. By running SMB map with the host as the target's IP, we can just map over the shares and see what's open for us. We can see that there is a share called WebServer that is read-only, which obviously means that we can only read the contents of the files in this specific share. So we log in using the command smb client at target's IP and the share web server -n to specify that we don't want to use a password. In that way, we will log in as a guest. We successfully log in, and now all we have to do is to check the available files in this current directory. And we can see that there is a file called enter.txt. We can just run the command get enter.txt to download the file on our system. It's that easy. Now we output the file and see that there are some credentials for something called Subrion. We can also see that there are some leftover messages for the developers that might give us some ideas to where to look. For example, this message specifies that the Subrion endpoint must be fixed. There are also some credentials missing from the WordPress website, but we'll get to that later. About the credentials, it seems like the password is cooked, just like us, because it's encoded. I spent a few minutes looking around the website, hoping that I will find some hint about the magic formula. Even tried to do some complicated XOR with the admin username and the current password, but nothing seemed to work. In the end, in my desperate times, I thought about why not try to decode it with base64. And so I tried decoding it with base64, and who would have guessed that it didn't work. So as I was living in more despair and my hopes were down, I tried to decode it with base32, which I'm impressed that anyone uses anymore. But this time, compared to the attempt of decoding with base64, it also didn't work. And then I saw it. I thought that there are only 2 types of base encodings, 64 and 32. No, there is a random type of encoding that somebody thought about. It was base 58, the most random number on earth. So I tried decoding this super encrypted password with base 58. To my surprising, it actually worked. But now we have another super secret message to decode. This time it looks like it's either base 64 or base 32. And I could tell that by the way it looked. Usually base 64 and 32 have some equals at the end. So I further decoded the message using base 32, which gave me another encoded message in base 64, and obviously I decoded that. After all the despair that lasted about 15 minutes and all that decoding siesta, I finally got the super secret, unbreakable, unguessable, no one would think about password, Scam 2021. So I continued this adventure by going to the Subrion endpoint, but for some unknown reason, it redirected me to a non-working website and adds another Subrion at the end. But thankfully, we live in the 21st century and there is something called Google that will let us search information about this Subrion thing. I found out that there is an endpoint called /panel, so I tried it and got a login page. Now all is left to do is to try out the password and hope to God it works, because otherwise I would probably do something really bad that I would end up regretting. And of course it worked. Now with all this information, we can see that the website uses Subrion version 4.2.1, and if we search that on Google, we find absolutely nothing. I'm just kidding. We find an exploit specific for this version which could give us remote code execution, aka RCE. Luckily, this exploit is available on Exploit Database, which means that it has a really high chance of being available on the Metasploit framework. For those who don't know what Metasploit is, simply put, it's a framework used by pen testers and hackers to store and exploit vulnerabilities for different technologies based on their versions. So I found out that there is indeed an exploit available, which is the one I saw earlier. I use it, set the target IP, set the URI, the password, and my machine's IP address. I run the exploit and see that it surprisingly works, and you can tell that by the fact that there is a specific success message, Meterpreter session opened. Now all that is left to do is type shell, press enter, And I'm in. I breached the scammer server. But I don't have root yet. Actually, I don't quite have any kind of privileges yet. I'm just logged in as the user that is running the website. This applies to all websites. A user must run it, and it's usually called data. So how do we escalate our privileges, you might be asking? Well, we need to follow some really complicated procedures, but first of all, let's normalize our console because this one really sucks. So we open a terminal session on our machine and we will start listening to a specific port using netcat -lvmp at port lead, and then go back to the target shell and write this really complicated code that nobody understands but everyone uses because it works. And now by running some more complicated commands and I know what they do but I don't have enough brain cells to explain it, we normalize our terminal. Just so you can understand what normalizing means, before running all those commands, I couldn't scroll left or right between characters, or scroll between the used commands with the up or down arrow, and that is really annoying. So now we can just do all that. First of all, I looked for the so-called get the fuck out pins, which basically are some commands that people can create and let them run as root. And if I managed to find a vulnerable command by running it as root, it would let me possibly create or edit sensitive files with the root user. So I typed this complicated looking find query and I found absolutely nothing. Even though you see some results here, they are just some default commands that Linux has and they are no use to me because they must be run with more privileges than I have. Another thing we could do is to check for other users, and we can do that by simply outputting the file etc passwd, which every Linux system has and anyone can read it. We can see that there are many users here, but the thing is that they are not actually users. They are more like services used by Linux. But we can see that there is a user called scamsite, which you can tell that it's a user because it has the home set as home scamsite and the not so usual ID and group ID. So I tried looking into that user's directory and found a really underrated file called .bash history. But because this belongs to the user, I have no rights to read its contents, so I decided to leave it for later. After going back to /var, I checked the backups to see if there is any info in there, but there was nothing, so I decided to go back to /www/html from where I started. In that directory I found a folder called WordPress, and if you remember when we read the enter.txt from the SMB share, there was something missing in that file, and that was the WordPress credentials. So by entering the folder and knowing that usually the database credentials are in wp/config.php, I read that file and found out the database credentials. By connecting and scrubbing through the database, I found nothing useful because WordPress has a specific way to hash passwords and I didn't really think that I should change it. But I also couldn't crack it because it's a hash and that's its purpose. So I took a few steps back and started opening directories and looking for files, running the same find command a billion times, hoping that something would change, but nothing worked. So after about 1 hour of just me running around the rosy, I had an idea. The database password. It was right under my nose. So I tried the SSH login. And it worked. Fuck yeah. But we still don't have root privileges. But because we logged in on a new user with a password, we can run the most useful command, sudo -l, which will tell us the commands we can run using sudo, which will run the command as root. So for example, if I was to have access to sudo cat, I could actually read any file or create a file anywhere on the machine with the root user. We can see that we have a sudo access to the command iconv, which to this day, I have no idea what it does. All that I know is that we can now read and write files using other files. I mean, it still doesn't make sense to me as well. Okay, so we can use sudo iconv, but how do we use it? Here's where the .bash history comes into play. By reading the file, we can see that this user already used the command to read the file root.txt from root. So we do just that and get the root flag, which is a proof that we completed the machine. Now let's destroy it. So let's create a file called evil.txt. And in this file, we will write this specific command, which you can obviously tell it's a cron, and the stars basically tell it to run every single minute. Now, this command will basically set the elevated permissions of bean bash to root, so we can open a new shell with root privileges. Now, after writing the file, we just run this sudo iconv command with this little parameter that will output the file contents to another file in etc cron.d evil. And because everything that is written by root in cron.d runs without having the run permission set, it will automatically execute after literally 1 minute. After waiting the longest minutes of our lives, we can finally write the command beam bash -p, and now we have root privileges. Now all is left to do is destroy the machine. The easiest way to do that is by running this command rm-r *, which means remove everything recursively. And that's how the scammer has been stopped completely with unrecoverable damages.